The first sign of real trouble came when Jake decided that taking photos from behind the barrier wasn't good enough anymore. He had been watching other tourists pose with the guards for almost 20 minutes, and each photo seemed more daring than the last. A group of teenagers from Germany had gotten relatively close to one of the guards for a group selfie, and a family from Japan had managed to get their toddler to wave at the stoic soldiers. Jake's competitive nature kicked into overdrive. If they can get close, so can I, he muttered to himself, completely ignoring Sarah's increasingly urgent pleas to just move on to their next destination. The marketing executive from Miami could see disaster approaching like a slow-motion car crash, but she felt powerless to stop it. The moment that changed everything happened at exactly 11:47 a.m. Jake spotted what he thought was the perfect photo opportunity when one of the guards shifted slightly during his duty. Without thinking about consequences or protocols, Jake ducked under the red rope barrier that clearly marked the boundary tourists were not supposed to cross. The reaction from other tourists was immediate. Some gasped audibly, others started pointing and taking videos with their phones, and a few people actually backed away, as if they sensed something serious was about to happen. Sarah felt her heart sink into her stomach as she watched her travel companion stride confidently toward the guard, completely oblivious to the gravity of what he was doing. "Hey there, buddy," Jake called out cheerfully to the guard as if he were greeting an old friend at a barbecue back home in Texas. "Mind if I get a quick photo with you? I promise I'll be super quick." He held up his phone and flashed his biggest, most charming smile, the same one that had gotten him out of trouble countless times during his college years. The guard remained perfectly still, showing no acknowledgement whatsoever of Jake's presence or request. His eyes stayed fixed straight ahead, his posture remained rigid, and his expression didn't change by even the slightest degree. To Jake, this silence felt like permission to proceed, though anyone familiar with royal protocol would have recognized it as a serious warning sign. Emboldened by what he interpreted as cooperation, Jake moved even closer. He positioned himself right next to the guard, threw his arm around the soldier's shoulders as if they were best friends, and started taking selfie after selfie. With each photo, he tried different poses, peace signs, thumbs up, exaggerated, smiles, and even a few goofy faces that he thought would get tons of likes on social media. The crowd of onlookers had grown significantly by this point. What started as a small group of curious tourists had become a substantial audience of people who were either fascinated by Jake's audacity or horrified by his complete disregard for British customs and protocols. Sarah noticed that several people in the crowd were shaking their heads in disapproval, while others seemed to be enjoying the free entertainment. Jake, high on adrenaline and the attention from the crowd, decided to push things even further. He started trying to get the guard to break his stoic composure by making jokes, pulling funny faces directly in front of him, and even attempting to balance his baseball cap on top of the guard's bearskin hat. Each attempt became more elaborate and disrespectful than the last. What Jake didn't realize was that his actions were being carefully observed and documented by people far more important than the casual tourists taking photos. Palace security had been monitoring the situation from the moment he crossed the barrier, and additional personnel were already being quietly positioned around the area. The guard himself, despite his outward appearance of complete indifference, was following strict protocols for dealing with disruptive tourists. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, and he was fully aware of the various levels of response available to him depending on how far the interference went. Sarah made one last desperate attempt to save the situation. She called out to Jake from behind the barrier, her voice cracking with anxiety. "Jake, please, we need to go now. This isn't okay." But her words were lost in the noise of the growing crowd, and Jake was too caught up in his performance to pay attention to anything other than getting the perfect shot. The turning point came when Jake, frustrated that he hadn't gotten any reaction from the guard, decided to try something even more invasive. He reached out and actually touched the guard's uniform, brushing an imaginary piece of lint off the red tunic while grinning at his phone camera. In that moment, he crossed a line that would have immediate and serious consequences, though he had no idea what he had just set in motion. The explosion came without warning, like thunder after lightning. 1 second, Jake was grinning at his phone, admiring his latest selfie with what he thought was a very cooperative palace guard, and the next second he was face to face with a roaring lion in a red uniform. "Get back. Make way for the Queen's Guard." The guard's voice erupted like a cannon blast, so loud and commanding that every conversation within 50 yards stopped instantly. The sound seemed to echo off the palace walls and reverberate through Jake's entire body. The young Texan nearly dropped his phone in shock, stumbling backward with eyes wide as dinner plates. The transformation was incredible and terrifying to witness. The man who had stood like a statue for the past hour was suddenly very much alive, very much aware, and very much in control of the situation. His rifle, which had been held at a formal position, was now being used to march forward with precision and authority that made it clear this was not a person to be trifled with. Jake's face went from confident and amused to confused, and then rapidly to terrified as the full weight of his mistake crashed down on him. The guard continued his advance, his voice booming across the courtyard with commands that brooked no argument or hesitation. "Stand back! Stand back! Make way!" The crowd of tourists that had been giggling and taking photos moments before suddenly scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Parents grabbed their children and pulled them to safety. Elderly visitors clutched their handbags and backed away quickly. And the teenagers who had been filming everything on their phones suddenly realized they might be witnessing something more serious than a funny tourist moment. Sarah felt her legs go weak as she watched the scene unfold. Her worst fears were coming true in spectacular fashion. She wanted to run to Jake's aid, but something in the guard's demeanor and the reactions of the other tourists made it clear that getting involved would only make things worse. She stood frozen behind the barrier, clutching her guidebook so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Jake, for his part, was experiencing the kind of shock that comes with the sudden realization that you've made a terrible mistake. The friendly, approachable guard from his imagination had been replaced by a highly trained soldier who was clearly not amused by tourist antics. He tried to stammer out an apology, but the words caught in his throat as the guard's march continued relentlessly forward. I'm sorry," Jake finally managed to squeak out, his voice a fraction of its usual confident volume. "I didn't. No, I was just trying to get a photo." But his words seemed to have no effect on the advancing guard, who continued his intimidating march with military precision. What made the situation even more surreal was the contrast between Jake's casual, tourist appearance and the guard's formal military bearing. Jake, in his wrinkled t-shirt, cargo shorts, and baseball cap, looked like a child who had wandered into an adult situation far beyond his understanding. The guard, in his pristine red tunic and towering bearskin hat, represented centuries of British military tradition and royal protocol. The other guard, who had remained at his post during the initial confrontation, was now also alert and ready to act if the situation escalated further. Palace security personnel who had been monitoring the situation from discreet positions began moving closer to the scene, though they remained ready to let the guard handle the situation according to established protocols. As Jake continued to back away, stumbling over his own feet in his haste to escape the guard's advance, he knocked into a barrier rope, causing it to sway and drawing even more attention to the spectacle. The sound of cameras clicking and phones recording filled the air as dozens of tourists documented what was rapidly becoming a viral moment. The guard's voice rang out again, even more forcefully than before. "Move away from the Queen's Guard." The words carried such authority and power that even people who weren't directly involved in the confrontation found themselves taking steps backward. It was as if the voice itself had physical force behind it. Jake's face had gone from its natural color to pale white and was now approaching a shade of green that suggested his breakfast might not stay down much longer. The reality of being dressed down by a member of the Queen's Guard in front of hundreds of tourists and countless cameras was beginning to sink in, and it wasn't a comfortable feeling. What neither Jake nor most of the onlookers realized was that this was still just the beginning. The guard's initial response was designed to remove the immediate threat and establish control, but there were additional consequences coming that would turn this embarrassing moment into a much more serious situation with lasting implications for both American tourists. Before Jake could fully process what had just happened, 3 men in dark suits appeared as if from nowhere. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who were very good at their jobs and took those jobs very seriously. Sarah watched from her position behind the barrier as the men approached Jake, who was still standing in shock after his encounter with the guard. "Sir, we need to speak with you," the tallest of the three men said, in a calm but unmistakably authoritative voice. His British accent was crisp and professional, and something about his demeanor made it clear that this was not a request. "Could you please come with us for a moment?" Jake looked around desperately, hoping to spot Sarah in the crowd, but she was blocked by a wall of tourists who were still filming and photographing the aftermath of the confrontation. His mouth opened and closed several times as he tried to form words, but nothing coherent came out. The adrenaline from his encounter with the guard was still coursing through his system, and now he was faced with what appeared to be official questioning. I didn't mean any harm," Jake finally stammered, his Texas accent suddenly seeming very out of place in the formal British setting. "I was just taking pictures. I'm a tourist. I'm American." He held up his phone as if it were evidence of his innocent intentions, but the device only served to remind everyone present of how he had been documenting his inappropriate behavior. The man in charge nodded politely, but firmly. "We understand, sir, but there are protocols we need to follow when visitors cross security barriers near the palace. It won't take long, but we do need to ask you some questions and verify your information." His tone was professional, but left no room for argument. Sarah finally managed to push through the crowd and reach the edge of the restricted area. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice shaky with nerves. "That's my friend. What's happening? Is he in trouble?" She clutched her purse with both hands, looking between Jake and the officials with growing anxiety. One of the other suited men turned to address Sarah. "Are you traveling together, miss?" When she nodded, he continued. "We'll need to speak with both of you just to complete our report. Nothing to worry about, but we do need to document what happened here today." Jake was escorted to a small security office located in a building adjacent to the palace grounds. The room was plain and functional, with a desk, several chairs, and what appeared to be recording equipment. Sarah was asked to wait in an adjoining room while Jake was questioned about his actions and intentions. The questioning was thorough, but not aggressive. The officials wanted to know Jake's full name, passport information, where he was staying in London, how long he planned to be in the country, and whether he had any criminal record. They asked detailed questions about why he had crossed the barrier, what he had hoped to accomplish, and whether anyone had encouraged or assisted him. Jake answered honestly, explaining that he was just a recent college graduate on vacation who had gotten caught up in the excitement of seeing the famous guards. He insisted repeatedly that he had meant no disrespect and had simply wanted to get a good photo to show his friends back home. His story was consistent and his distress seemed genuine, which worked in his favor. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in the waiting room feeling sick with worry. She kept replaying the morning's events in her mind, wondering if she could have done something different to prevent the situation. The friendly London vacation she had planned was turning into a nightmare, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there might be serious legal consequences for Jake's actions. After about 45 minutes of questioning, Jake was brought back to rejoin Sarah. The lead official explained that while Jake's behavior had been inappropriate and potentially concerning from a security standpoint, they were satisfied that he was simply a misguided tourist rather than any kind of actual threat. However, the consequences weren't over. Jake was issued a formal warning that would be kept on file with palace security. He was informed that any future incidents involving royal properties or personnel could result in more serious legal action. Additionally, he was banned from returning to any royal residence or property for the remainder of his stay in the United Kingdom. The official handed Jake a document outlining the terms of his warning and explained that he would need to sign it to acknowledge his understanding of the restrictions. "This is quite serious, Mr. Thompson," the man explained. "The Queen's Guard are working soldiers, not entertainment. The barriers and protocols exist for very important security reasons." Jake signed the document with a shaking hand, his earlier bravado completely deflated. The reality of how close he had come to much more serious consequences was beginning to sink in. Sarah stood beside him, equally subdued as they prepared to leave the security office and face whatever remained of their London vacation. As they walked back toward the palace gates to collect their belongings and leave the area, Jake turned to Sarah with genuine remorse in his voice. "I'm really sorry I ruined our trip," he said quietly. "I had no idea it was such a big deal. I thought they were just for show." By the time Jake and Sarah returned to their hotel that evening, the damage was already spreading across the internet like wildfire. Unbeknownst to them, dozens of tourists had captured the entire incident on their phones, and the videos were already being shared on social media platforms around the world. The first sign that their private embarrassment was becoming public. Humiliation came when Sarah's phone started buzzing with notifications while they sat in a quiet pub trying to process the day's events over fish and chips. Her sister in Miami had sent her a link to a Twitter video with the message, "OMG, is this Jake? This is everywhere." Sarah's heart sank as she clicked the link and saw a crystal-clear video of Jake draping his arm around the guard, followed by the explosive reaction and his terrified retreat. The video had already been viewed over 50,000 times and was rapidly climbing. The comment section was brutal, filled with people from around the world expressing their outrage at Jake's disrespect and their amusement at his comeuppance. "Jake," Sarah said quietly, sliding her phone across the table, "you need to see this." Jake's face went white as he watched himself on screen, looking foolish and disrespectful in a way that seemed even worse when viewed from the outside. The angle of the video made his actions look even more invasive than they had felt in the moment. More videos began appearing throughout the evening. Different tourists had captured different angles of the incident, and each new perspective seemed to make Jake look worse. One video focused on his overconfident approach to the guard. Another captured his terrified, stumbling retreat in painful detail, and a third showed the concerned faces of other tourists as they watched the scene unfold. The story was picked up by news outlets within hours. "American tourist harasses Queen's Guard" became a trending topic, with news websites around the world running stories about the incident. British tabloids were particularly harsh, with headlines like "Yankee Doodle Dandy Gets Royal Treatment" and "Tourist Learns Hard Lesson About British Manners." Jake's social media accounts, which he had planned to fill with exciting vacation photos, became battlegrounds of criticism and mockery. People from his college, his hometown, and complete strangers from around the world began commenting on his posts, sharing the videos, and expressing their opinions about his behavior. His Instagram followers increased dramatically, but not for reasons he would have wanted. The worst part was how the story was being told. In most retellings, Jake was portrayed as an arrogant American tourist who had deliberately disrespected British traditions and military personnel. The context of his genuine ignorance and the fact that he had meant no harm was lost in the rush to create an entertaining story about tourist misbehavior. Sarah found herself caught up in the viral storm as well. Several videos clearly showed her trying to warn Jake in her obvious distress during the incident, but some commenters criticized her for not doing more to stop her companion. Others defended her, pointing out that she had tried to intervene and was clearly embarrassed by Jake's actions. The hotel staff began treating them differently as news of their involvement in the palace incident spread. What had been friendly, welcoming service became polite but distant professionalism. Other hotel guests would point and whisper when Jake and Sarah passed through the lobby, making them feel like they were under constant scrutiny. Jake stopped, leaving the hotel room except when absolutely necessary. The confident, outgoing personality that had gotten him into trouble in the first place completely disappeared, replaced by anxiety and shame. He spent hours reading the comments and news articles about the incident, each one making him feel worse about his actions and their consequences. Sarah tried to salvage what remained of their vacation by visiting museums and attractions on her own, but she found it difficult to enjoy anything knowing that Jake was back in their room, depressed and humiliated. The trip she had saved for and planned so carefully had become a source of stress and embarrassment rather than joy and adventure. The viral nature of the incident meant that the consequences extended far beyond their time in London. Jake's family back in Texas began hearing about the incident from friends and neighbors who had seen the videos online. His mother called in tears, worried about his safety and embarrassed by the international attention his behavior had attracted. Even worse, potential employers began learning about the incident. Jake had been job hunting since graduation, and several companies that had been considering him for positions quietly withdrew their offers or stopped responding to his applications. In the digital age, his moment of poor judgment had become a permanent part of his online presence, easily discoverable by anyone who searched his name. The irony was particularly bitter for Jake. He had crossed the barrier and disrespected the guard specifically to get attention and create memorable social media content. He had certainly achieved both goals, but not in any way he could have imagined or wanted. The viral fame he had inadvertently achieved would follow him for years to come, serving as a permanent reminder of the importance of respecting local customs and thinking before acting. 6 months after their disastrous London vacation, Jake and Sarah's lives had settled into a new normal, shaped by the lessons learned from their encounter with the Queen's Guard. The viral video had eventually faded from the internet's short attention span, but the personal impact on both travelers continued to influence their perspectives and choices in profound ways. Jake returned to Texas a fundamentally changed person. The confident, impulsive young man who had thought rules were suggestions and authority figures were entertainment had been replaced by someone much more thoughtful and respectful. The public humiliation and its aftermath had been devastating, but it had also been educational in ways that no classroom or textbook could have provided. His job search, which had been significantly complicated by his internet notoriety, finally bore fruit when he found an employer who was willing to look past his viral moment. During the interview, Jake had been completely honest about the London incident, taking full responsibility for his actions and explaining what he had learned from the experience. His genuine remorse and personal growth had impressed the hiring manager, who decided to give him a second chance. Jake's new job was with a company that specialized in cultural sensitivity training for businesses operating internationally. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that his spectacular failure to understand and respect British customs had ultimately led him to a career helping others avoid similar mistakes. His personal experience with the consequences of cultural ignorance made him uniquely qualified to teach others about the importance of research, respect, and appropriate behavior when visiting foreign countries. Sarah had returned to her marketing job in Miami with a new appreciation for planning and risk assessment. Her colleagues were initially curious about the London incident, having seen the videos online, but she handled their questions with grace and used the experience as a teaching moment about travel preparation and companion selection. She never blamed Jake publicly, but privately she had learned valuable lessons about setting boundaries and speaking up when she saw trouble brewing. The experience had also strengthened Sarah's passion for travel, but changed how she approached it. She began writing a travel blog focused on cultural education and respectful tourism, using her London experience as a cautionary tale about the importance of understanding local customs before visiting new places. Her posts about proper etiquette at tourist attractions and the real stories behind famous landmarks began gaining a following among thoughtful travelers. Both Jake and Sarah maintained contact with each other, though their friendship had been forever changed by the London incident. They spoke occasionally about their shared experience and how it had shaped their subsequent choices, but the easy camaraderie of their college days had been replaced by a more mature, reflective relationship built on mutual understanding of how quickly things can go wrong when traveling. The Queen's Guard who had confronted Jake never knew about the long-term impact of that October morning encounter. For him, it had been a routine application of established protocols designed to maintain security and dignity around royal properties. He continued his duties with the same professionalism and dedication that had made his response to Jake's intrusion so effective and memorable. The incident became part of the informal training stories shared among palace security personnel, an example of how tourist situations can escalate quickly and why established protocols exist. New guards were sometimes shown the viral video as an example of how proper response techniques can diffuse potentially serious situations while maintaining the dignity and authority of the position. For other tourists visiting London, Jake and Sarah's story became a cautionary tale shared in travel forums and guidebooks. Their experience was cited in articles about respectful tourism, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of understanding that working military personnel are not tourist attractions. Many travelers reported that seeing the viral video had made them more conscious of boundaries and protocols during their own visits to royal sites. The broader lesson that emerged from their experience was about the power of respect and the consequences of assumptions. Jake had assumed that the guards were essentially performers rather than working soldiers, that rules were flexible for friendly tourists, and that his intentions mattered more than his actions. Each of these assumptions had been proven wrong, in spectacular fashion. Years later, when people occasionally recognized Jake from the old viral video, he would acknowledge the incident honestly and explain how it had changed his life for the better. He had learned that real confidence comes from knowledge and preparation rather than bravado, that other cultures deserve respect rather than amusement, and that the most memorable experiences are often the ones that teach us the most about ourselves. The London incident had ended their vacation early and caused months of embarrassment, but it had also provided both travelers with invaluable life lessons about respect, responsibility, and the lasting consequences of our actions. In the end, their encounter with the King's Guard had taught them more about the world and themselves than any conventional tourist experience could have provided.